there were signing lines in which six, seven, eight people would say to me, you know, would you sign this book for my son-in-law who just found out that his father isn't his father? And each time I was a little blown back by the experience. And honestly, first of all, most of the people I met had not taken the test themselves. Somebody had been led to them by taking the test, a child, a cousin, a sister, that kind of thing. And second of all, while there were some people who had had positive experiences because of the revelations from these tests, most of them had had negative experiences, some of them very negative experiences. And again, I was gobsmacked to discover that my imagination had taken me to a place that lots of the people I met on tour had been living in.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with Grub Street Community of Writers and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, the creator and producer of this author series and director of literary programs at American Ancestors. We're delighted you're with us tonight, this evening, for a mix of fiction and fact, looking at DNA testing, mothers, families, and female friendship. On your screen is the schedule for our 75-minute event. Soon, our featured author, Anna Quindlen, will take the screen to discuss her new novel, More Than Enough, with our guest moderator, Bill Griffeth. Now, moving on to introductions, Anna Quindlen is a novelist and a journalist whose work has appeared on fiction, nonfiction, and self-help bestseller lists. She is the author of many novels, including Object Lessons, One True Thing, Black and Blue, Blessings, Rise and Shine, Every Last One, Still Life with Breadcrumbs, and Miller's Valley. Her memoir, Lots of Candles, Plenty of Cake, published in 2012, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her book, A Short Guide to a Happy Life, has sold more than 1 million copies. While a columnist at the New York Times, she won the Pulitzer Prize and published 2 collections, Living Out Loud and Thinking Out Loud. Her Newsweek columns were collected in the book Loud and Clear. I have hosted an interview with Ms. Quindlen before, and I am really delighted to have her with us again. Now, for our moderator, it is an equal honor to welcome back to the series author Bill Griffeth. Bill covered Wall Street for almost 40 years. In 2019, he retired from day-to-day anchoring duties at CNBC and became an anchor at large. Among many awards, he was nominated for 6 Cable Ace Awards as Best News Anchor. Griffith is the author of several books, including The Stranger in My Genes, a memoir, and its sequel, Strangers No More, both American Ancestors bestsellers. Have At It, Sister was an Audible true crime original. Bill Griffith is a former trustee of my organization, American Ancestors, and lucky for me, he's joined us as an expert and moderated several panels on DNA and surprises in family history research. So you're in good hands with him. The luck continues as I am welcoming back as well Libby Copeland, who has great knowledge and insights on DNA testing. Libby is a former staff reporter at the Washington Post and an award-winning journalist. She has written for The Atlantic, Slate, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, explores the rapidly evolving phenomena of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications on American culture today. It's a fabulous book for those of you interested in understanding DNA testing. Libby will join us for the last third of our program. But for now, let's welcome Anna and Bill. It's great to have you here and with so many interesting topics to discuss. Anna, I loved your book, as Libby also said in the green room. It's a fabulous, fabulous story and the view into my favorite big city and into many families. I finished it a week or two ago, but it is still with me and it will stay with me. Thank you for writing that and welcome. And over to you too.
Thank
Thank you,
you, Mark.
Margaret. Go ahead, Anna. Accept your accolade. It's well deserved.
Well, it's so nice to hear that. It really is. I mean, you labor away on these things for a couple of years, and to find readers is a wonderful feeling.
We're here for you. We're
It,
delighted.
for those who haven't read it yet, and I'm not going to do any spoilers here, it's the story of 43-year-old Polly Goodman, who's a high school English teacher in the New York City area. Her husband, Mark, is a veterinarian. She's a member of a book club of four very close friends. And as a joke, they give her a DNA test kit. And she takes this test, and it's no joke. The result that she gets, very puzzling. Just by way of background, it's been 14 years since I took my DNA test that told me that my father, in my case, my father was not my father. So I can very much identify with some of the emotions that you gave Polly after she got this test. Why did you write this book?
I'm really interested in family. I basically think family is the only thing worth writing about as a novelist. I mean, most of the war novels are about bands of brothers. Jane Austen writes about one wacky family after another. And so I'm always looking at the way people come together and come apart as family members. And over the last couple of years, I'd heard over and over again about DNA testing. And I thought that that might be a fulcrum for a way of looking not only at the families we come from, but at the families we choose, and the differences between the two, and whether one has greater weight than the other. I mean, I think people early days fastened on the DNA test um, uh, to talk about this novel, but really it's a novel about how we create families for ourselves in the modern era.
I, as I read this book, let me just say, we call ourselves NPEs. Uh, that's short for not the parent expected. Geneticists have a more quaint way of expressing NPEs. That's the non-parental event that we are the result of. But as an NPE reading your book, I was nodding the whole time because I could identify with the emotions and the other responses that Polly had throughout this whole thing. And the question I had the whole time was, uh, has Anna taken a DNA test? I mean, you wrote so knowingly about the responses of people who had taken a DNA test and got a strange result. You had to have taken a DNA test, didn't you?
Well, first of all, it's so thrilling to hear you say this because, you're sitting in a little room making things up. And in your mind, you're thinking, what am I getting wrong? So,
Right.
for example, infertility is a big part of this novel.
Yes.
And that's something I've never experienced. And yet on book tour, people kept coming up to me and saying, boy, you really understood that. The dementia of a parent is a part of this novel. And again, people told me, you really understood this. And one of my triumphant moments was getting an email from the director of the Bronx Zoo because
Where
because
Mark works.
Polly's husband Mark
Yes.
is a vet at the Bronx Zoo, and they asked who I had patterned Mark after because there were apparently a lot of bets laid at the Bronx Zoo. I don't know any vets at the Bronx Zoo. I made it up. So it's incredibly affirming, Bill, to hear you say what you just said, because the truth is, I've never taken a DNA
That
test.
is astounding, I have to say, because you nailed it. You truly nailed
Thank
it.
you.
And I know there are some of my friends, my NPE friends out there. Some have read it, some have not, and they will agree with me. Those who have, because there is an emotion that you cannot fully describe to other people when you get this result back that tells you that the truth you believed to be your life is not your life. It's astounding. Let me ask you this. Did you write this? Are you the kind of novelist, because you're so popular and you write bestsellers? Did you write this because you believed that DNA testing was a viable uh, and popular enough topic to write about? Or do you write novels just because they would interest you at the same time? Because there are
The,
so many
the
people out there.
second,
You were telling me that you've met so many people, NPEs, during your book tour. You were astounded about that.
I was flabbergasted by that. I mean, obviously, I wrote this book about a specific set of events, and yet when I was encountering people who had had that experience over and over again, when I was on book tour, I, I was sort of breathless. I mean, there were signing lines in which six, seven, eight people would say to me, would you sign this book for my son-in-law who just found out that his father isn't his father? And each time I was a little blown back by the experience. And honestly, first of all, most of the people I met had not taken the test themselves. Somebody had been led to them by taking the test, a child, a cousin, a sister, that kind of thing. And second of all, while there were some people who had had positive experiences because of the revelations from these tests, most of them had had negative experiences, some of them very negative experiences. And again, I was gobsmacked to discover that my imagination had taken me to a place that lots of the people I met on tour had been living in.
That is, it truly is amazing. I'm gobsmacked to learn that you just made all this stuff up. But I did know, I realized as I was reading your book, I saw what you were doing here, Anna Quindlen, the different variations of family that exist out there for Polly, the different relationships that she had, not just with her husband, but with her family, her immediate family, her mother, her brother, her father, her friends in the book club, and so forth. I'm curious how you define the word family.
Well, that's complicated for me. I do think that more and more these days, there's this new phenomenon of people creating a family of friends. But I'm from a family on my father's side that takes itself quite seriously. In fact, I've never had to do any kind of genealogical background on my family because so much of it has been done by Quindlen men before me. Um, but I've thought a lot about the fact that my paternal grandfather was the eldest of nine. My paternal grandmother was the youngest of 13.
Wow.
Perfect match. Um, and my paternal grandparents had 32 grandchildren. So I'm one of this group of 32. And we all sort of lived pretty close to each other and saw each other on a regular basis. So the idea of creating a family of friends was a little de trop. We had so much of a family of family that we didn't know quite what to do with them. The truth is that that kind of family doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, I will say sometimes my grandfather was the eldest of nine, and most of my friends are taken aback by that. But in the neighborhood where I grew up, all the families were of that size. And the family of friends, the family of coworkers, the family of extended family has come into being in part because that immediate family that stayed put
Yes.
doesn't exist anymore. We're all spread out, and our families, as we all know, are much, much smaller. I mean, when I was growing up, an only child was a huge aberration. Now they're commonplace.
I can't speak for all NPEs out there, but I can tell you that many, many, many of us, me included, had to rethink this word family and what it meant, because you now had a group of strangers who shared your DNA. One person told me one time that I had two families now. I had the biographical family that raised me, that I grew up with, that I knew, and I had the biological family of strangers that I didn't know. But in your book, you also have, I think, family relationships with the book club ladies, family relationships that Polly establishes later, because I don't want to give any spoilers out there, but there are people that she comes in contact with. But it's hard to describe them in the traditional sense of family. We have to come up with a new definition. We have to come up with new words or ideas about what it is to be a family, don't you think?
Well, my best friend always says that I'm her sister from another mister. So that's how she covers it. But to go back to what you were saying and to go back to your book, I wonder, I was thinking today if by any chance I found out that Prudence and Robert V. Quindlen were not my biological parents, which I think is, I won't even say highly unlikely. To me, it seems impossible given how young they were and that I was the eldest child. But you should be a cautionary tale for me. But
Yes.
if if that turned out to be the case, I wouldn't, I think I would find it difficult to think of either of them as anything but my mother and father. And I wonder if that's true of the people that you've talked to who have had these surprising DNA results, that despite it all, that genes are not the be all end all, that love and connection and being raised by someone is the thing that matters.
Well, the thing that the mantra, if you will, that I finally settled on after all said and done was that blood may be thicker than water, but love is thicker than blood. And
That's
I think you portrayed that well in your novel as well, right?
And yet we've been urged so much to delve into genetic traces, in
Yes.
part because of our own health. I mean, as a woman, I had to keep track of the fact that my mother had ovarian cancer, and I have other friends who have really charted a course based on their mothers having breast cancer or themselves having the BRCA gene. So there's this emphasis on genetics that again didn't exist when my grandparents were starting their families, and that makes some of this more powerful than it might be otherwise, I think.
I and that brings up a topic that all NPEs must confront at some point. Literally half of our genetic background is a blank slate. It's a black hole. You know, my doctor would ask about my family's medical history, and he well knows this. I could only give him half of it. I didn't know the other half. So it behooves us to pursue this not just for curiosity purposes, but to learn some very important information about our medical history. As it happens, my biological father and one of his sons, one of my half brothers, had Parkinson's. Now, I've taken all of the DNA tests that are out there. I've done them all. including 23andMe. And according to 23andMe, and they say this is not a diagnosis, but it is, something to keep an eye on. I don't have the marker for Parkinson's. So, we can always keep our fingers crossed.
Oh,
But
oh my gosh.
but this is very important. I mean, people need to know, uh, based on what we know about medical technology these days, there's a lot of DNA in there, immunotherapies based on the DNA that's within each of us. If you don't know where your DNA came from, you don't know what's possible out there, and doctors won't know how to treat you.
Well, you won't know where your DNA came from, but does that define where you come from?
Right, right.
I mean, that's, the reason that this book ends in the way it does with a scene between Polly and her father, who is in an assisted living facility and has worsening dementia, is because I think Polly will think of her father as her father um, forever, no matter what, in part because they have such a powerful emotional connection. But certainly that's something that I've thought about um, a lot.
And that scene had me in tears, literally, at the end, because not just because I'm an NPE, but because my father also had dementia, the father that raised me. So it was a very poignant moment there. But the other side of that equation, the mother, my experience has been, mom ends up being the bad guy in a lot of these stories, and they're the ones that don't want to tell the story, but it's because they got caught.
Well, wait a minute,
I
though.
know where you're going. Go ahead, you first.
I mean, women get tarred with stuff like this in a way that men never do. I
Right.
mean,
I agree. I agree.
no man was ever sent to a home for unwed fathers.
Right.
And so I look, Polly and her mother have a difficult relationship anyhow. And one of the questions that I think is implicit in the novel is that difficult relationship is because her mother has felt this sense of dis-ease about the primal connection between them. But I think a lot of it's more than that. It's that they're kind of dueling characters in a lot of ways. But I do think that mom does look, mom gets blamed for everything.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, so one of the most astounding stories I heard was really early on. Woman stands up at an event and says, well, I'm really interested to read this novel because I just found out that the little boy who lived across the street, who I used to babysit for when I was a teenager, is my brother.
Yeah.
We're in this room filled with women. I've written this novel about this. I sort of fall back. Everybody in the room gasps and everything. And when she came up to me later, I said, "Want to walk me through?" And she said, "Well, finally I got up the nerve to ask my mother about it." And my mother said, "Yes, your father was his father. And um but I want you to tell him that his mother didn't cheat on his father, his father that he grew up with.
Right.
It was the 70s and we were swapping." And I just thought, okay, this gives us a whole nother feeling that mom wanted to lift from this boy any sense that he might have of blaming his mother for what had happened, as opposed to the blame that mothers so often have to carry.
Did you do that on purpose? I mean, the relationship between Polly and her mother, who is a judge, a respected professional, who is very aloof and distant from her daughter. Um, did you do that on purpose, knowing that there what the underlying relationship, their underlying reason for that might be? Was that part of it?
I did not. I think I would have written that relationship in exactly the same way, even if there hadn't been that question. Um, uh, one of the great things about going on book tour is that readers tell you things about your own work that haven't occurred to you, which is wonderful. And one very astute woman came up to me and said, "Well, this is the companion piece to your novel, One True Thing." And I went, whoa. And she said,
Oh,
one true thing is the daughter who is completely invested in a life in the world and has kind of contempt for her mother, who is what we used to call a housewife. And this is about a daughter who feels like her mother kind of sold her out by having that life in the world. And it's
wow.
all about the choices that women have made over the last 50 or 60 years or so, and how sometimes they drive mothers and daughters apart. If I had $1 for every one of my friends who is highly accomplished, whose daughter has at some time or another said to her, it's hard being your daughter, I'd be a very rich woman. And I think that's what Polly feels. And I also wanted to explore, we're so unforgiving about motherhood. You must do it this way. You must have the baby sleep this way. You must have the baby eat this way. You must do this. You must do that. And there's that moment where Polly says to her sister-in-law about her mother going to law school and then becoming a lawyer and then a judge. Sometimes I felt like my brother and I weren't enough. And
Hmm.
her sister-in-law says, "What if you weren't?" I just wanted to be able to say there are all kinds of ways to be a mother, and this tyranny of perfect motherhood, I can't be dealing with that anymore.
I didn't need to put a bookmark in here because there was a statement in your book near the end, and I won't say who says it and I won't say the context, but the statement itself speaks for itself, where you wrote, "Everyone needs to know where they come from. I don't mean who they need to love or cleave to or follow, but having a mystery in your family tree can eat away at a person." I am so lucky that my mother was still alive when I took that DNA test those many years ago. She was 94 years old, and we lived on opposite coasts of the country. And I didn't want to confront her on the telephone with this. I wanted to be in person. So, as fate would have it, it was on her 95th birthday when I presented the DNA results to her. But if she weren't alive, and if Polly's mother wasn't still around, I mean, the mystery, it would eat at somebody if there was no, where would you go to find the answer to who you are? What is your true identity? What is the truth about who you are?
But let me flip that, Bill. Did you ever think about not saying anything to your mother?
Well, I will say I didn't want this to influence the final days of her life, because I knew it would be troubling to her, and it was. But at the same time, I felt the need. I wanted to know the truth. I mean, what? Why not? Right? Um, and as it happens, I could identify with Polly's relationship with her mother to a degree, because my mom and I were very close early on, and our whole life until the DNA test came out. And after that, we were not that close. And I'll tell you why, because she was afraid I was going to keep bringing it up. She didn't want to talk about it. At one point, when I brought it up, she said, "I thought you were going to forget about this now." It's a very tenuous situation. I'm confronting a huge embarrassment for her, but in the name of trying to learn the truth. And I just wonder what Polly's relationship with her mother is going to be if there's a sequel to More Than Enough, if there's something more than enough to come out of all of that.
Well, I'm hoping that the fact that Polly is going to build a family of her own will make her more tolerant about the choices and the difficulties that her mother had. But I'm not 100% sure. I mean, her brother really gives her a talking to about that
Right.
and says at one point, I always thought that if you became a mother, you'd understand her better. And over again, you will hear women say that they did understand better. But the part of this that we don't engage with so much, and I bet your mother had to psychologically engage with is when you're talking to somebody about this, to some extent, you're talking to them about their sex life. And for women of a certain age, that's so off the conversational grid that they can't even begin.
Mhm.
Your story reminds me of three sisters who came up to me together at an event and told me that because I think one of their children had taken a DNA test, it led to the discovery that they had an older brother who they didn't know about. Not an older half brother, an older full brother, because their parents in college had been together, had had a child, and had given it up for adoption. And it had really poisoned their relationship with their mother.
Wow.
Their father was already gone.
Hmm.
And when they went to their mother, she said, I was going to leave you a letter to be read after I died. The idea of confronting this head on in real life was just too much for her.
I have there are a number of people that came to me after my book came out to tell me their stories, and I call them our DNA club. And one of the women that I've become friends with told her father did the exact same thing. Mom was gone. She took the test. She learned the truth. She confronted dad. He didn't want to talk about it, but one day, finally, he said to her, I want to show you something. And he took her to his computer and he showed her a letter he had written that he had planned for her to find after he passed on. The truth will come out, but it's the way you deliver that truth, I think, is as important as what the truth is. If my
Uh-huh.
mom were forthcoming about it, I think our relationship would have been fine. But the fact that she stonewalled, and I understand why she did, but the fact that she did stonewall, I think, is what put that separation between us there.
I wonder if there's a generational aspect to that. I mean, your
Yeah,
mother
absolutely.
was of two generations removed from you and I just wonder if someone is confronting a mother who is 50 or 55, if there's a whole different way of engaging
I
with this.
I totally agree. As after all of these stories came out, and my own story, as my daughter liked to say, so much for the greatest generation. Uh,
Well, and the other aspect of this that's been talked about so much is we used to have magical thinking around adoption.
yes,
And we wouldn't tell people who were adopted that they were adopted because if we don't say anything, if we just magically absorb them into the family, it will be as though they had come from our bodies.
right.
And um and what we found out over time was that was not really true or oftenly true. People. And that sort of shifted so that people are much more open about it at the same time that they feel the need to say, at some level, adoption basically says genes are less important than that blood is less important than love.
There are some states, though, that still keep their adoption records sealed, and it's difficult for people to go back and find out who their biological family is, which that's a whole other story. So I'm curious. After all is said and done, you've written the book, you heard from all these NPEs, you've heard my story. Are you curious at all to take a DNA test?
I'm not. Um,
And
and I'm not, by the way, I'm not nervous about it now, although do have to say. So, I'm the oldest of five children. I have a brother who's barely a year younger than I am. Our parents got together and got married very young. And my father wound up being a 40-year-old widower with five children. And one day we were discussing the DNA test, and my brother Bob said to me, "Yeah, don't take one of those." And I was like, "Well, I'm not taking one, but why, Bob?" And he goes, "Remember those years when Daddy was dating like it was his job?" And I started to laugh. He said, "Don't take one of those." But that hasn't really come into my thinking. I grew up in a family with such a strong sense. People would say to me sometimes, "Oh, you didn't change your name once you got married." The idea of changing your name from Quindlen in my family is like spitting in your soup. Um, a family that, there's all kinds of records of fighting in the Revolutionary War and fighting in the Civil War and genealogy that honestly I'm not that attached to, but members of my family were so engaged in that I have this profound sense of where I came from and who I am and who they are. And it's not that I would be afraid to shake that. I'm not sure I would believe in it. Does that make any sense at all? That
well, go ahead. I'm not sure I understand what you mean, that you wouldn't believe in it.
I mean, they're my people.
Yeah.
I don't care what the inside of my cheek tells you. Those are my people. And I have a lot of bad medical juju handed down from my mother. And it's, something that I've been very engaged in and been very careful about and so on and so forth.
Good. Yes.
Um, but I just I don't know. I just have this profound sense of belonging in the family from which I arose. And of course, I know about the family that I've created because I had three unmedicated births and I know those babies.
They're yours. Yes.
Um,
But let me switch that around a little bit.
uh-huh, sure.
I was the family historian, for good or bad. I mean, I'm huge in genealogy. As Margaret mentioned, a trustee of the American Ancestors Genealogical Society, and I wrote a book about this family going back 400 years. They were my family until I took the DNA test.
But they are your family, right?
Tell me that. Tell me that they're my family when we don't share the same DNA.
Ju-
That's the definition I'm talking about. Are we still family if we don't share the same DNA? How can you? I mean,
Well,
you have to understand. I lived for these people. I knew them more than just names and dates and locations. They were real human beings that I got to know after doing all this research and visiting the places where they lived in Europe and parts of the New Amsterdam colony and so forth. And then I take a DNA test, and I'm not related to them anymore.
Well, and obviously, the fact that you are so engaged in genealogy and that you did all this work makes this much more troublesome than it might be for someone else, right?
Like somebody who really doesn't care,
Who never thinks twice about,
like my brother. Yes.
their lineage or whatever it is. But when you say, I really say they're my family if we don't share DNA, you can't say that because then you're taking away the family connection of every adoptee in the world.
That I get, and
Yeah,
but I think I'm different. Well, I'm not different from an adoptee if they didn't know they were adopted and they find out, right?
right, right,
But if they know that they're an adoptee,
right.
they know what's what, and they can either choose to search for that family, the biological family, or not. In my case, I had no clue. I mean, like you say you're convinced that if you took a DNA test that, Robert and Prudence are your parents. No question about it. Well, I would have said the same thing 15 years ago
Uh-huh.
until I took the DNA test.
Okay, so give me the bright side of this development. This,
I I am in touch with members of my biological family who were strangers until a few years ago, and I have new family now. We are close. We've visited together. They came to my son's wedding some years ago. It opened a new window in that regard. So yes, there is a positive to all of this, but boy, was there some darkness in between time.
they must have been as surprised to see you as you were to see them.
My joke was that I was going to show up and say, here's the story, and they were going to say, oh no, not another one.
Did your mother know that you were in touch with them?
Kind of. Mom made it to 100. I can tell you that. And
Good genes, Bill.
yeah,
Good
I know. And
genes.
and my biological father made it to 88, even though he had Parkinson's. So I'm hopeful about all that. But so I had been in touch with the biological family before she passed, but I didn't bother her with all of that.
Uh-huh.
At that point, I knew that was not a thing to do. Unlike Polly, who mentioned in her meeting with her mother.
Well, she sort of comes sideways at this in the oddest possible fashion, and spends about half the book, with the help of her brother, who is in denial about this, trying to convince herself that a mistake has been made.
Right.
Brother keeps telling her that she got the shadiest possible DNA test and that obviously they blew it somehow. But of course he has anxiety too because he doesn't want to feel that he's less to her than he was before.
I trust me, I've been there. Denial is the first thing you think. There must be a mistake. It can't be right. And the fact that, and I discussed this with many of my friends, there were NPEs. In my case, and in many of the cases, I have no full siblings. They're all half siblings. I was the youngest of five in the family I grew up with. But of my three sisters and my brother, now I realize they were not full siblings. They're half siblings. On the biological father's side, he had two sons and a daughter. They're half siblings. They are as related to me as the siblings that I grew up with.
When you were growing up, did you have any kind of spidey sense about your siblings? No. Do you look alike? Do you
I,
act alike?
there were hints. I guess I brought it up in my book, the second book. There were some times when we went to extended family events, when I would say to my wife as we left, "Am I from Mars?" You know, I we're not really the same, but but that happens. I mean, are you
Yeah.
exactly the same as your siblings, your four
No,
siblings,
we're
right?
we're all very, very, very different. And I'm working on a new novel now where there's a kind of a family secret at the heart of it. And one of the things that I'm exploring in it and that I mention in it is, if you have more than one kid, every kid gets a different parent. I mean, my oldest got a different mother than my youngest did. My oldest broke me in. My youngest had the mother who had two other kids and was hair on fire and so on and so forth. So they all sort of wind up,
Yeah.
somewhat differently.
Well, I should have known. My four siblings were much older than me. My brother is the youngest of those four, and there's a 16-year difference between him and me. So right there, that might have been a red flag. But anyway, let's bring in Libby Copeland, because you said we were talking before we started this
I
program.
said I know
You
nothing.
know nothing about DNA, which I found
Nothing.
hilarious.
Libby knows everything.
And Libby's here to set the record straight, to tell us the story about where we are today in DNA testing, and the good things and the bad things about what it has done to our culture and our society. Welcome,
Yeah,
my dear
thank you.
friend.
Thank you.
And can
Thank
I
you.
ask you one question to begin with? I was at an event in Traverse City, Michigan, and there were probably 300 people in the audience. And the moderator said, "How many of you have taken a DNA test?" And it was more than half. I
Yeah,
would say it was close to two-thirds.
yeah.
Is that pretty typical?
So I have numbers to show you, believe
Right?
it or not. But this is a self-selecting crowd. The people, by the way, so the book, as I told you before, I loved. And this conversation about like family and what it means. This is just an incredible meditation on nature versus nurture and the meaning of family and all that kind of stuff that I think this moment that we're in, this DNA moment, has brought forth. But you're at book events hearing from the people that I heard from, which is this group of people that really, for the most part, didn't exist 20 years ago. They are so hungry for support, for normalization. And so, they're not the majority of Americans, but they're a very surprisingly large minority of Americans. And they're really quite desperate for a bigger conversation, which is why this conversation that we're having here, I think, is so important. um, I couldn't agree more that this is really about, like, writing about family is the thing. So I'm going to go through some slides I have that I think we're going to pull up, and I'm going to show you the numbers, Anna and everyone else. So, just talking a little bit about this idea of the explosive power of secrets, the pull of family, biological family, the family we've grown up with, what's family, all that stuff we're talking about. So I want to give some context to this whole conversation, because this is my field as a science journalist. This field that we are talking about, that wonderful Polly, spits into a tube, sends it in, that's called recreational DNA testing. That's the industry that we're talking about. And it has, frankly, in the last just over 25 years, fundamentally changed our understanding of the American family, of genetic identity, of the past, of ourselves. This kind of DNA testing, where you spit into the vial, you get back your ethnicity and your genetic kin. This is something that started right in 2000. And I'm going to move on and show you this. These are the sort of headlines. As Anna's book shows, this major unintended impact of the industry. The surprises are everywhere. This industry started with a niche company in 2000 catering to genealogists. And the unexpected outcome is the thing that I've been interviewing people about for the last 10 years. How is it that you could make a single $70 purchase on a lark and it would profoundly alter your life? Or, in More Than Enough, Polly gets it as a gift, right? I did. I got mine as a gift too, back in 2017. So, these are the headlines that reflect this phenomenon of people getting back their results and learning the answer to a question they did not even realize they were asking. And then
Yes.
the fact of being, you cannot unknow that once it's known. Right. And Anna, you and I are in positions where you haven't tested, I have. Neither one of us has found something majorly surprising, but I will say that two things on that score. One is we're all implicated by this technology, which I'm going to talk about, and it may just be a matter of time. And the other piece is that I think it's hard to imagine the situation until you're in it. And I say that as an outsider, but just having talked to people, that it is such a profound experience. It's like one of the, you open the box, you can't close the box. And
Bill makes that very clear.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to say it's been 15, 14 years, whatever it is. I say the wound has healed, but there's still a scar there. And I still think to myself once in a while, you've got to be kidding me. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, the shock kind of never ends. So
never.
I'm going to show you some stats on the next slide. So we have
about 55 million people having commercially tested their DNA. Now, the greatest concentration of those folks are in the United States. Okay, so, you know, Polly in Anna's book is grappling with the ramifications of this sweeping technological change, this idea that you could, you know, for less than $100 in a few weeks, you can look inside your cells and you can see the past written there. And the surprise is that people are finding in DNA databases come in a number of buckets. They're the most sort of common buckets that I've listed here. And they tend to do with unexpected parentage from, say, hidden adoptions, from donor conceptions, and from affairs, and also previously unknown siblings. And what I found in my reporting is that, you know, if you go back, and actually genealogists know this when they do work, there's actually no one size that fits all formula for family, right? This kind of 1950s idea of a standard shape of a family, that's always been a myth. And there have always been secrets in families. But the difference is now that the ease with which you can discover your genetic ancestry, whether or not you're prepared or planning to learn this truth that you cannot know, and then how it will fundamentally change how you see yourself and your most intimate relationships. So,
Libby, of those 55 million people, are there noticeable tranches? Are women more likely to do this than men? Are older people more likely to do it than younger people?
So I don't know if women are more likely to take the test, but they are more likely to dig. And this is anecdotal, but I have found, even in the main protagonist in my book, you know, she had a brother who tested, she tested, he ignored the results that made no sense, she dug in. And over, I found that it's the women who are kind of doing the connecting. So if they're finding results, they're like kind of diving in, but that's not always true. It's just a sort of a tendency. What I will say about who tests, it's primarily Americans of European descent. So because this is a kind of a leisure activity, it's something that happens on the higher socioeconomic spectrum. So you're talking about wealthier, older, whiter Americans testing. And that contributes to how much European American DNA is in the database. So,
if I may add to that, think about this, Anna. We're a bunch of hybrids here in the United States. So people, in many cases, will take a DNA test to find out their ethnic background, as Libby suggested.
Yeah.
In Europe, this is not as popular by far. Why? Because you're French. You know, all your ancestors are going to be French. You're English, all your ancestors are going to be English. There's not as much of a big question to be answered as there is from the ethnic standpoint. You know, it's that other thing that the people don't expect to get.
But it's interesting that you talk about it being overwhelmingly white, because I would anticipate that there are some of my Black friends who would be interested in finding out whether there are, in fact, European ancestors that they have.
Well, they probably already know that there certainly are, and it's just a matter of who, right? If their ancestors lived through enslavement, yes, there is a proportion. And in my book, I write about a man named Rosario who, he's exactly in that bucket. He thinks he's Italian. Turns out he's part Black. His mom hid it. It's like an unbelievable story. There's a number of stories like that where people have managed to trace pretty far back, even back to certain peoples in Africa. But there's also been a great deal of hesitancy on the part of Black Americans and other minorities because of the police infiltration of these databases. That's a whole other story, right?
What we were talking about before.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Can I bring this up now, Libby, or do you have more here?
Let me get through these, and I'll just show you, just because this is the part interested. This may make your jaw drop, Anna. This is the part that I wanted to show you, which is this, because we're all implicated by this technology, whether or not we've tested. So Anna, Bill, if you had never tested your genetic material, because it's shared, your genetic material is already represented in these databases, right? Because well over 15% of the US adult population has tested. So let's say we're talking about someone else, not to put anyone on the spot, but Joe over here in the corner, and he does not want to test. But let's say one of his siblings does. That's it. They don't need his consent, and then the truth is revealed. A first cousin, could be the reason that you discover a previously unknown sister, a niece, right? So to the extent that we no longer own our own destiny in terms of whether or not we get to choose whether we're going to find out, that is what makes, I think, this relevant to people even when they haven't tested.
I don't know if you heard me mention to Bill, but almost everyone who mentioned to me that they'd made some kind of discovery
Yes,
had not tested themselves. They
right.
had someone close to them or not so close to them test, and then the genetic chain continued.
Right, exactly. And because you're talking about family and because you're talking about like the way a single decision like kind of ripples like a pond across an entire family network, you're really saying like one person tests, it can closely impact 8 to 10 people.
Right.
So, this has certainly touched probably the majority of Americans in some way.
We,
Um,
we've
yeah,
we've had many questions coming in, and I think this might be a good time to bring that up because the three of us talked about this before we
yeah,
did the program here. People are asking, there are so few legal protections.
yeah.
What about the privacy issues? Congress has abdicated on this. Is that a concern? Should it be a concern? And I know lots of people who decide not to take a DNA test because of the privacy issues as well. Uh, Anna, what do you think? Are
Well,
you
first of
okay?
all,
They've found serial killers. They've found other bad guys out there because they found their DNA of relatives out there, and they were able to catch people. There is some justice that's been achieved as a result of DNA testing. But at what
yeah, but
cost?
I'm a big promoter of personal privacy. I actually have been surprised at how simple a lot of these companies have made it, as I told Libby earlier,
Yes, so was I.
to access DNA databases. I thought from the very beginning that they would all fight tooth and nail not to cooperate with law
Right,
enforcement. And in
right. And
fact, that hasn't been the case.
some have and some haven't, but it's it doesn't, in some when it matters, it certainly matters if your DNA is one of the databases that decided to cooperate or didn't. But in another way, it doesn't, because the whole industry then gets painted with this brush of that your privacy isn't necessarily protected by this. So certain companies like Ancestry was quite staunch about it. But company like Family Tree DNA, which started in 2000, was the first company to do this, was working hand in glove with law enforcement and the FBI before their customers knew. And they could do that because it's a business contract that they can unilaterally change and then simply notify you. In their case, I think they didn't quite notify people right away. And there's no regulation. There's very little regulation around this, which I think is proving to be quite a problem, because in without the regulation, we have no guardrails to put in place. And so, of course, maybe there'll be some legal decisions down the road. They'll be decades later.
Libby, were any of these companies prepared for the psychological ramifications of what they were selling?
Yeah. So, I noticed in the chat, someone wrote in and said, what kind of support is there for people like us? Right. I think
Yes.
there was a woman who said, I'm an NPE, like not parent expected. And, the thing that I noticed, so I started reporting on this industry in 2017, 2016, and there was so little support from the companies. It's really not their area. This is not their jam. But they're selling kits on the idea of ethnicity. That's the selling point. That's see the Ancestry ads. Are you part Swiss? Are you part whatever? Are you part Korean? There's a certain way in which, because Americans have sort of assimilated their way out of language and food and religion and identity, if they came over, say, between 1880 and 1980, right, that power of assimilation means that a lot of Americans, particularly white Americans, don't even know where their grandparents come from, which is shocking to me, but
Right.
actually quite common, right? So if you don't know that, if you're sort of not attached to place, if you've moved around, if you don't know who your grandparents were, you do want to take a test because you just want to see what proportion you are Italian.
I have a
And the
close
genetic
friend.
kin part comes in, and that's where the surprise comes that you were not waiting, that you were not asking for.
I have a close friend who's an NPE, and I know she's watching. And she reached out to me wondering if there are any psychologists or
Yes, there
psychiatrists out
are.
there who
Yes,
specialized in this,
yes,
because you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist and you lay it out, you lay on the couch and you tell your story. And many times, and I've heard this from other people as well, they say, well, look at you, nothing has changed. You're the
yeah,
same person. You still have the same husband or wife. You still have the
right.
same home,
But
the same job. What has changed?
right. And yet there's
Everything
this
has changed.
profound way
Yes,
in which you are completely upside down. Your insides are outside, and you because as I've said to you before, Bill, when we talked about this, you can't have a story in which your own once upon a time doesn't hold true. Like you
yeah.
discover a difference about your own beginnings, it profoundly alters the way you write the rest of your story. It can't help but do that, right?
Anna, don't you wish you knew all this before you wrote this book?
But what I was going to say was psychologists, yes, and there are organizations and there are psychologists, and of course, right now I don't have the links at my fingertips, but there's a whole genre of like grassroots organizations catering to this. It's just not the companies.
Right. Yeah, I belong to a couple of private Facebook groups, um, and one of them has roughly 10,000 members. I mean, it has grown exponentially in the last few years as people, we sort of joke about it, but we get the new bees coming in January and February because they got their new DNA test at Christmas time or Hanukkah.
Oh,
Exactly.
interesting.
And they get the results, and suddenly there are new people showing up at our doorstep, telling pretty much the same story that we told years ago from all of that. So the cycle continues on as people are in denial that
Mm.
this could ever be possible, and yet it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll speed through a few more because I know there are more questions out there. But so this is Alice. I wrote a nonfiction book about this phenomenon a few years ago. The woman at the center is this woman named Alice. What's interesting about her stories is sort of a surprise. It's not this one of the more common scenarios that I showed earlier, and it takes her actually on a 100-year journey back into time, and it becomes like a kind of a whodunit for the testing age, the genetic testing age. But what strikes me about Alice's story and some of the other people who have interviewed and told their stories is that the past isn't really over. That's sort of what we're learning in this moment, right? This DNA era, this has made this a moment of reckoning for the American family. It's this moment of intergenerational tension, which I think your book, Anna, really gets at this idea of like and you were talking about it, the two of you earlier with Bill's own account, this question of what am I entitled to know? And when my knowledge about my own genetic identity bumps up against my mother's right to privacy about her sexual life, or maybe she was assaulted, or something that maybe isn't even taboo now, but 65 years ago was so shrouded in shame we don't even speak of it. Whose rights prevail? And what the DNA age has done is it effectively made that question moot, because it just becomes where, who can have the information. And it used to be, as a matter of course, you were not entitled to that simply because you couldn't have it. And now you can. And so it's shifted something in, I think, the power balance between the generations, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Oh, that's
They're
interesting.
not the
I never thought of it that
your
way, but of
parents are no longer
course,
the gatekeepers, right?
yes, yes.
They cannot be in charge of that information. So this is just a sense. There's a lot of studies happening right now about like, what does this all mean, right? How does DNA testing alter the way we think about race and ethnicity, how we define paternity, the role of nature and nurture, which is, I think, why More Than Enough is so like powerful and compelling, because whether or not you've tested, these are resonant themes that we all think about all the time when we're thinking about the person in the mirror, right? This moment of genetic discovery is basically reinforcing these essential questions about what makes us us. And yeah. So anyways, that's sort of I think a fascinating series of themes. this is my book. This is a nonfiction take on the science, the industry, and most of all, the human experience of DNA testing. And I was able to present this book and to read Bill's remarkable memoir. Anyway, I'm so honored to be able to share some of my research on this topic and really to share my deep appreciation for More Than Enough, which I think is such a nuanced and compassionate take on an important topic that's affecting a lot of people. So I'm going to stick around for Q&A, and I know you're coming back to moderate us.
And this is what really fascinates me as I read your book, Anna. Libby and I say this with great affection, we're both nerds about this. And, a lot of the books that come out about all of this are nerdy books. Yours is, to my knowledge, the first written about this topic by a person of your stature and of your accomplishments. And I find it fascinating. And I wonder what it means in the scheme of things that DNA testing in some ways is finding its way into mainstream. And we're able to confront it now and maybe come up with some rules and regulations that will put those guardrails on that Libby was talking about.
Yeah, and it's like part of the texture of American life now, right? And I think the fact that you're writing about it really reflects that.
But does that mean that people have changed their attitudes towards it? It feels like a lot of people blunder into this. And
well, you certainly don't go in expecting to get the result you got. Yeah.
Maybe in the year 2000 or 2001, that was understandable. But 26 years out, I think people know more about the pitfalls and yet continue to blunder. Is that unfair, Libby?
Yes. Well, I would say it's not a pitfall for everyone, right? So, like I've tested a bunch, and for me, it's been like the vast majority of people who test, it's just this kind of fascinating delving into history that augments. Like, we found like an ancestor in Sweden and like went to Sweden and met her. Like I found out some of my Jewish ancestors in Ukraine lived through World War II. Like they're like, one of them's like mayor in this tiny town in Ukraine. They stayed. Like I would not have known that I had any connection to contemporary Jews in Ukraine or contemporary person in Sweden without that. So the way in which it makes your a big world smaller, that to me is such a profound gift. That's why I tested, and that's why I think a lot of people stay in the databases, and it's why I'm so ambivalent about this technology. I can't come down strongly on one side.
And because you didn't have the kind of
let me tell you
that Bill has had.
But even if I had, okay, I've interviewed over 400 people, and not a single person who had Bill's kind of experience regretted testing. And I think Bill might tell you that is true for him. Do I have that right, Bill?
Only one person, a dear friend of mine from years ago, who on taking the test, and I won't go into the whole thing, it was in one of my books, he learned that he was adopted. Mom by this time was gone, dad was gone, and so forth. And his wife asked him one time, would you take the test again if you had the chance? And he said no, he wouldn't want to know. But for the most part, yes. I mean, I think when people learn the truth, they realize that that's an important thing to know, good or bad. The truth sets you free, as the old cliche goes.
It's a crazy phenomenon. I've interviewed a woman who had been conceived out of an incestuous, forced sexual experience, and even she wanted to know the truth. So the thing about this topic that's so wild is that everything you expect goes upside down.
And that's why, with affection here, Anna, I can't believe that one of the great novelists of our generation, who won a Pulitzer Prize for a column that we all read back in the New York Times days, you don't want to know. You're not interested. You're not,
I respect that. I totally respect that.
It's not that I don't want to know. I'm going to try to say this with humility. I feel like what I need to know about my family, I already know. I,
Okay.
I
No,
know that doesn't
Famous last
sound
words.
some
I feel like it's
exactly,
important.
exactly, but
Like there's a saying in the industry among like the search angels and genetic genealogists is like, if someone doesn't want to test, don't push it. Because if they don't want to, then if they find something they didn't want, you know, they're not fully able to claim agency over the experience. They're going to resent you for the rest of your life, right?
I
actually in my immediate family, to find out that we aren't Irish would be much more traumatic than almost anything
That's what
else.
I
happened to
I
Alice.
I have a
Oh,
That's what happened to Alice in my
I have
book.
a very good friend who has an Irish name, and he told me recently they took a DNA test and found out that he's 50% Ashkenazi Jew. And the name was changed from the Jewish name to the
ah,
Irish name during World War One because they were German Jews in the United States, and they felt the need, for obvious reasons at that time, to
wow,
change the name away from the German sounding name to an Irish
wow.
name. So,
And then
big
it's like this
difference.
gift of discovering the past, right? And reclaiming it.
Right. I have a question here from a professional historian. It's not a question, but what she says is that she's looking at her ancestry and it altered her way of looking at history, much to my surprise. As you see your ancestors' involvement in events, it personalizes that history. And it's like a magnifying glass on the past in a way perhaps not reflected by a previous examination of a nation's past. And I couldn't agree more. This personal, this is what I call bottoms up history as opposed to top
Yeah.
down that we're all used to studying in school. This personalizes your history and makes it, I think, more meaningful in many cases.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
all stunned by that.
No, it's
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of genealogical research among my paternal family. And, knowing, first of all, they're Irish immigrants, right? So everybody assumes that they're fairly recent to this country. In
mhm,
fact, they came in the 1750s. And looking at those documents that show the wars that those men fought in
I bet.
made made them and the conflict of them being Irish American and yet fighting for America seem much more real to me than it would have otherwise.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at some of the other questions here. Does it make a difference to people who find out that they're not a biological member of a family who raised them if their new family is notable, prestigious, or a celebrity? Many people who were hoping when they took a DNA test that they were related to the royal family of England. I can't tell you the number of people who told me that they were hoping that they would come up with a
Well,
famous
a
personality.
good example of that though is there's a wonderful novelist named Mona Simpson, and Mona found out that her mother had given up uh, her son for adoption. And when Mona dug in, it turned out that her older brother was a guy named Steve Jobs. And
Wow.
they became very close. They became very close. But, did Mona experience some people saying, well, that was a lucky break, lady? Sure she did.
Right.
But, sometimes you do discover that somebody who's well known I mean, Jeff Bezos was adopted by um the man he considers his father. So there's some of that out there.
Yeah.
It is.
Sure.
Um, our time is up. I want to bring in Margaret here, but I also want to thank Anna and Libby. I could talk about this all day, even at this late stage in my life, and the number of years it's been since I took the test. I'm still, even at this stage, having people come up to me and tell me their story. And people want to tell their story. This is like telling the birth story all over again.
Yes.
This is like
Absolutely.
being a rebirth story of sorts. That they
That's That's what I've experienced with the novel out there. This has
Yeah.
been so
It
interesting. What
has
an
been
interesting conversation.
really remarkable. And Anna, I'm so glad that you agreed to join us. It was an offbeat ask, and it's offbeat to have you here, but offbeat is where it's at these days. And we are all the better for knowing about your novel. And so many of us are wanting to read it. I've read it, but those of you in the audience, you will really enjoy it because you have been lighting up the chat with comments about this evening and this book. So our great thanks to our three guests. Now, as we move toward closing, a quick thanks to two partners. First, Grub Street here in Boston, loved by many of us. This organization is among the nation's leading creative writing centers, and they hopped on the opportunity to help promote Anna's event. Grub Street offers online and in-person classes, events, and it offers a community for writers, creative writers. It's on a mission to make creative writing accessible to people from all backgrounds, genres, and career stages. Learn more at grubstreet.org. Our thanks to GBH Forum Network for their promotion, post-production, and archiving of this and many other of our programs here at American Ancestors. Their video of this event will be available in about 3 months to the general public. Meanwhile, it's just for you guys who signed up tonight. And back to my organization, American Ancestors, we have helped a lot of people with DNA questions. So if you're researching a person, a family, a new family, to you, an old family, if you've taken a DNA test and you're confused about who your relatives are, my colleagues are here to help you. As a free service, you can chat with one of our genealogists. You'll see on screen some of the coming educational programs hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center, or you can visit our headquarters and our Family Heritage Experience Museum at 97 Newbury Street in Boston's Back Bay. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect people just the way we've done here tonight. Many thanks to our three superstar guests this evening. We're just lucky they were able to talk fast and get so much information in. Billy, speed. We have nothing on the daily. We have it all over the daily here in terms of speed of covering topics. Their focus on fiction, the mix of facts on DNA and fiction has been really fascinating. So thanks to our producer, Lauren Vitaco, behind the scenes. Thanks to our partners again, Grub Street and GBH, and to our audience this evening. We are so glad you joined us. We would not be here without you. We live to share these things with you. So we appreciate your joining us, and we applaud your interest in fiction, family history, DNA. Libby and Bill will do more on this topic through my organization. And Anna, we'll see you with the next book, which we didn't get to ask about, but we're all waiting. We know it'll be interesting. And to the audience out there, we'll see you again. For now, a very good night to everybody. And thanks again for joining us.